Ada Renner came home from town on a Thursday and found the railroad had driven stakes through her land while she was gone. Survey stakes. A whole row of them marching across the 40 like they already owned the ground under her feet. One of them stood in the grave. Her husband's grave, on the rise at the edge of the field, the earth still raised. They'd hammered a stake right into the mound where Emil lay. She did not weep. She walked up the rise, and she took hold of that stake, and she pulled it out of him with both hands. Then she carried it down to the house. 3 days later, a man named Harlan Voss stood on her porch with a printed paper. $312 for 40 acres. Sign it in 40 days or the court would take it for less. And he said it plain, the way you'd tell a child. The line's coming through, Mrs. Renner. The only choice you've got is whether you're paid or not. What Mr. Voss didn't know was that my Emil surveyed every section corner in this county for 30 years. And the map in his desk did not match the one the railroad had filed. So the next morning I drove the old survey chain and a lawyer's card into town. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before I tell you the rest, do one thing for me. Subscribe so you don't lose the thread. And comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far a story about one widow and a whole railroad can travel. Tell me where you're sitting right now. Then come back, and I'll tell you what I did. Now, let me start where it started. Kellner's Ford, Osgood County, Nebraska, the autumn of 1909. If you've never heard of it, that's the point of it. It was the kind of town you could miss between two breaths on the road. A grain elevator, a church, a store that sold everything and enough of nothing. The Weddell River ran cold and brown along the south of the county, and everything a man grew had to get across it or rot in the field. I had lived there 40 years by then. Emil and I came out when the ground was still just grass, and we put our name on a 40-acre patent the way you'd put your name in a family Bible. 40 acres. Not a great deal of land. But it was ours down to the last clod, patented free and clear from the federal government, and there is a particular kind of quiet a person feels standing on ground that nobody can question. You don't notice it until somebody tries to take it. The patent hung on the parlor wall, by the clock. A framed thing, yellowing under the glass. Emil's name and mine and the great seal pressed into the corner. I dusted it twice a year and never read it. I never once thought I'd need to take it down. It was just there, the way the clock was there, the way the wall was there. You don't read the deed to your own house. You just live in it. My husband was the surveyor for this county. 30 years he carried the chain and the transit over every quarter section between the river and the county line. If a fence went up crooked, they called Emil. If two neighbors fell out over a boundary, they called Emil, and whatever he said, that was the end of it. Because Emil didn't take sides, and Emil didn't guess. He measured. His desk in the back room was full of it, plats rolled and tied with string, field notes in his small square hand, the brass chain coiled in its box like something asleep. I couldn't read half of it when he was alive. He'd try to show me. He'd spread a plat on the kitchen table and put his finger on a little inked square and say, "That's the Odland place. Ada, see the corner." And I'd nod and pour the coffee and think about the bread. He died 2 winters back. Went out to check a line fence in January and his heart quit on the walk home, and a boy found him sitting against a post like he was resting. I put him up on the rise at the edge of the 40, where the ground lifts before it breaks down toward the river. There's a draw there. The old-timers call it the Renner cut, because Emil surveyed it and Emil's name stuck to it. A long, soft descent where the tableland folds down toward the water, the only gentle way off the high ground for a mile in either direction. I picked that spot for him because from up there you can see the whole 40, and because in the evening the light comes across it a certain way. I put a plain stone. I went up most mornings with my coffee. I talked to him some. That's nobody's business but mine, and I'll tell it plain anyway, because you should know what kind of ground they put a stake in. So, that was the world. A widow, A 40, a grave on the rise, and a desk full of a dead man's careful work that I did not yet know how to read. Remember all of it. Every piece of it comes back. The railroad came the way weather comes. You feel it before you see it. All that summer there'd been talk in the store about the Trans-Meridian pushing a branch line down toward the new bridge they meant to throw across the Weddell, and the elevators they meant to build so the grain could move by rail instead of by wagon and ferry. Progress, the men called it. They said it the way you'd say a good harvest. The Trans-Meridian was going to make Kellner's Ford somebody. I listened and poured coffee and didn't think much on it, because a railroad is a great far-off thing, and my 40 was a small near thing, and I did not see how the one had any business with the other. Then I came home on that Thursday. I'd been in town for thread and a sack of flour, an ordinary errand, gone maybe 3 hours. And when I came up the lane, the first thing I saw wasn't right, and it took me a moment to understand why. There was a line across my field. A straight line, too straight for anything that grows. Stakes. Little squared wooden stakes with a fleck of color on the top, driven into my ground at even spaces, running from the road across the near field and up. My chest went tight when I saw the direction of it, up toward the rise, toward the cut, toward Emil. I left the flour in the wagon. I walked out along that line of stakes, and I want you to understand there had been no letter, no knock, no word. A man will ask before he borrows your ladder. These men had come onto my patented ground while I was buying thread and driven their marks into it and gone, and left me to find it like you'd find a strange dog had been in the yard. I followed the stakes up the rise. And there, at the top, at the edge of the 40 where the ground lifts, they had driven one straight into the grave. Into the raised earth of the mound. Right through the middle of it, standing up out of my husband like a thing planted to grow. I stood there a while. I'm not going to pretend at what I felt, because the truth is I didn't feel the big loud thing you might expect. I felt very cold and very clear. The way you feel when the stove goes out in the night and you wake up already knowing the fire's dead. I knelt down. I worked that stake loose out of the soft ground, back and forth, the way you work a fence post, and I pulled it free. It came out with a little suck of earth. And I turned it over in my hands. There was a brass tag on it, a little stamped brass tag, tacked to the wood. And in raised letters it said, T.M. Co., Trans-Meridian Railway Company. I read that tag 3 times. And then I did a thing I've thought about since, because I don't fully know why I did it. I did not throw the stake down. I did not break it. I carried it home, all the way down the rise and into the house, and I set it up on the mantel over the cold hearth, standing on its flat end, the brass tag turned out so I could see it. Like evidence. Like something I meant to keep. I didn't have a word yet for why. I just knew a man had signed his name to what he'd done to my husband's grave, and I meant to hold on to the signature. That night I couldn't settle. I kept going back to the mantel and looking at the thing, and I noticed something that a farm woman notices and a railroad man apparently did not. The line of stakes hadn't run across the flat of the field, where a track would want to be, level and easy. The line ran for the rise. It ran for the cut. All those stakes were pointed at the one place on my 40 where the high ground breaks down soft toward the river. I didn't understand it yet, but I noticed it. Hold on to that too. 3 days after the stakes, the man came. It was mid-morning, and I was at the wash when I heard the buggy in the lane, a good buggy, a rented rig, and a man got down from it who did not belong to any farm I knew. City boots. A derby hat. A leather case under his arm, the kind that holds papers and nothing useful. He came up onto my porch without being asked, and he took off the hat like that made it polite. "Mrs. Renner," he said. "Harlan Voss. I'm the right-of-way agent for the Trans-Meridian Railway." "I know what you are," I said. "I found your stake in my husband's grave." That set him back about half a second. Only half. He had the kind of face that has decided a great many things in advance, and one of the things it had decided was me. He looked at me and he saw a farm widow, gray coming in at the temples, wet hands, An apron. He saw somebody the day was going to be easy with. I've seen that look on a horse trader. It's a look that's already spending the money. Regrettable, he said about the grave. Not sorry. Regrettable, like weather. The survey crews work from the plat, ma'am. They don't always see what's on the ground. And he opened his leather case on my porch rail and took out a printed paper and turned it to face me. The company's building a branch line through to the new bridge, he said. Your 40 sits in the corridor. Now, I'm authorized to make you a fair offer, and I'd counsel you to take it, because the alternative isn't as pleasant. He put his finger on a figure. $312. For the whole 40. That's $7.80 the acre, which is a good deal more than scrub like this brings at auction, and I think you'll agree it's generous. I looked at the paper. I did not touch it. And if I don't agree, I said. Then the company files to condemn, he said. Easy as anything, and the court sets the price, and I'll be honest with you, ma'am, the court sets it lower. Always does. You'd be paying a lawyer to get yourself less money and lose the same land. He folded his hands. You've got 40 days to sign. After that it goes to the court, and after that it isn't yours to sell. And then he said the thing I have carried in my chest ever since. The thing he said the way you'd explain a simple sum to a slow child. The line's coming through, Mrs. Renner. The only choice you've got is whether you're paid or not. Now I want to stop here and tell you who was on the road. Because it matters. It mattered later more than Voss ever dreamed. The Odland brothers were coming back from the elevator with an empty wagon, close enough to hear, and they'd slowed the way men do when they smell something wrong. And young Peel, the clerk from the grain elevator, was walking the lane with a tally book still in his hand, and he was near enough that he heard it too, and being a clerk, and bored. He wrote the time and the words in the margin of his book. Voss never noticed them. A man that's sure of himself doesn't count the witnesses. He should have counted the witnesses. I said, 40 days. 40 days, he said, and he smiled like we'd come to an understanding, and he left the printed offer on my porch rail and put his derby back on and drove off in his rented rig. And I stood there with my wet hands and watched the dust of him go down the lane, and the Odlands lifted their hands to me from the road, a small grave gesture, and drove on. I did not sign anything. I did not cry. I went inside, and I dried my hands, and I stood in the parlor a long minute in front of the clock. And then I did the thing I'd never done in 40 years. I took the patent down off the wall. I carried it to the kitchen table, and I laid it flat under the lamp, and I read it. Really read it, word by word, the way you read scripture when somebody's died. The description of the land, the metes and bounds, Emil's name, my name, the seal. And I read what 40 it was, in the government's own words, the exact quarter of the exact section, our 40. The north and west 40 where the house stood, and the field ran, and the rise lifted, and the cut came down, and Emil lay under his stone. Our patented ground. Named to the letter. And then I went into the back room, and I lit the second lamp. And I opened Emil's desk. I hadn't opened it since the funeral. It smelled of him, of pipe and paper and the machine oil he kept the transit in. And I sat down in his chair and I made myself do what I'd never bothered to learn. I unrolled his plats. I found the county sheets in his small square hand. I found the Renner 40 and I put my finger on the little ink square the way he used to, and I heard his voice saying, "See the corner, Ada." And by God, this time I looked at the corner. It took me half the night. I'm not going to tell you I read it quick, because I didn't. But I had one thing Voss didn't count on. I had 30 years of a careful man's work in front of me, drawn by a hand that never guessed. And by the time the lamp was guttering, I understood two things, and I want you to understand them with me, because they are the whole spine of this. And if you get them now, you'll see the trap before Voss ever did. Here's the first thing. Voss had let me keep a copy of the survey description the railroad had filed. It was printed right there on his offer, the legal words for the land they meant to condemn. And I laid the railroad's description down next to Emil's plat and next to my patent, 3 papers side by side under the lamp. And I read all 3, and they did not match. The railroad's paper described a 40, but it was the wrong 40. It described the southeast quarter of the quarter, the south 40, down along the low ground toward the river. Alkali scrub. Sour dirt where nothing but greasewood grew, the piece of the section nobody had ever wanted. The piece that in 40 years I'd run maybe 6 sheep across and given up on. That was the land in their petition. The south scrub. Not my patented 40. Not the house, not the field, not the rise, not the cut, not the grave. Some clerk in some office, working fast, working careless, paid by the mile like Voss was paid by the mile, had written down the wrong quarter of the wrong section. And nobody had walked the ground to check, because who checks a farm widow's dirt? They had come to condemn the land the tracks needed. And the paper they'd filed named land the tracks could not use. Now here's the second thing, and this is the one that turned the cold in my chest to something else. I sat there with Emil's plat and I traced the ground the way he'd taught me. The tableland up high, dry and level, where the corridor came in from the east, and the river down low, and between them, the drop. And I saw what my husband had known for 30 years and I'd only ever half listened to. There was exactly one place a railroad could get down off that high ground to the bridge site without a grade so steep no engine could pull it or hold it. One soft descent. One gentle fold in the bluff where the ground let you down easy. The Renner cut. On my 40. The patented one. The one with the grave on it. The one their petition never even named. Everywhere else along that corridor the bluff came down hard and broken, a wall of clay and shale that no branch line on the Trans-Meridian's budget was ever going to cut through in the year they had. Emil's own field notes said it in his small square hand. Grades, elevations. The word steep underlined once because Emil didn't underline things twice. The only way down was through my cut. And my cut was on ground they had not bought, had not offered for, and in their own filed papers did not appear to know I owned separately at all. They had condemned the useless 40 and left the only 40 they needed sitting in my hands, clear title, free and patent, the deed hanging by the clock. I sat back in Emil's chair. The lamp was almost out, and I'll tell you what I felt then because it's the truest thing in this whole story. I did not feel triumphant. I felt him. I felt my husband in that room. 30 years of chain and transit, every corner he ever set, and I understood that the careful, patient, unshowy work of a quiet man who measured instead of guessed had just reached up out of the ground where they'd driven their stake and handed me the thing I needed. Voss thought he was dealing with a farm widow. He was dealing with Emil Renner's 30 years, and he did not know it, and he was not going to know it until it was far, far too late. I put the lamp out. I did not sleep. And in the morning I hitched the wagon and I put the old brass survey chain in the bed of it, and Emil's plat rolled and tied, and I drove into town, and I did not go to the railroad's office. I went to see a lawyer. Josiah Penn had an office over the store, up a flight of outside stairs with his name on the glass gone half to flakes. He was past 60 and half retired, and he'd known Emil 40 years, and he owed Emil a favor that Emil had never once called in, which is a debt that only gets heavier with time. He let me in and cleared a chair of law books, and I laid it all out on his desk. The stakes. The grave. The offer. The 3 papers that didn't match. And I watched an old cautious man read them and go slowly still. "Ada," he said at last, and he took his spectacles off. "You understand what you've got here?" "I think I do," I said. "I want to hear you say it, so I know I'm not fooling myself." He put the papers square with his fingers the way careful men do. "They've filed to condemn the South 40, he said. "The scrub. That's what their petition describes, in law, in the exact words. And the court will grant it, because the railroad has the charter power to condemn a corridor, and a scrub 40 for $300 is nothing to fight. They'll take it, they'll pay you the pittance, and they'll think they've won." He looked up, And then their crews will get out there to build, and they will discover, on the ground in the mud, that there is no way down to the river across the land they just bought. And the only way down is on the 40 they didn't buy, I said. The one I still hold. Clear, the one you hold clear, he said. And he said the word held like it weighed something. Ada, a right-of-way agent, is paid to secure a corridor. He is not paid to walk the bluff. He read a clerk's description, and he made you a scrap offer, and he never once climbed your rise to see what the ground actually does. And you? He almost smiled, an old dry lawyer's ghost of a smile. You married the one man in this county who knew what the ground does better than God. I did not smile back. I wasn't ready to. But something in me steadied. So what do? I said. Do I tell the court? Do I stand up and say they've named the wrong land? And here is where Penn, cautious to a fault, wanted to save me. And here is the first place I had to push him, because his instinct and mine were not the same. The safe thing, he said, is to contest the condemnation. Go before the court. Say the description's defective, say they've overreached, tie it up, make them refile, drag it out, and hope for a fairer award on the honest land. He spread his hands. It's slow, it's expensive, but it's safe, and you'd likely get more than $300, and you'd sleep nights. I thought about that. I thought about it standing there in that dusty office with my husband's chain in the wagon below and his stake on my mantel at home. And I found I did not want the safe thing. The safe thing was begging a court for a bigger scrap. The safe thing was me, hat in hand, asking the same men who'd staked my husband's grave to please be a little more generous. I was done being the person things happened to. No, I said. I don't want to fight the condemnation, Josiah, he blinked. Ada, let them have it, I said. Let them have the scrub. Every word of it, exactly as they filed it. I won't say a thing to the court. I won't correct the description. I won't warn the judge. I put my hand flat on the papers. I'll let them win the 40 they asked for. And I'll say nothing at all about the one they need. And now watch him understand it. Because this is the part I want you to carry. Penn went very still again. Then he got up, slow, and he went to his shelf, and he took down a book so old the spine had given up, and he found a page he'd clearly found before, in some case 40 years gone, and he laid his finger on it, and he taught me the thing that changed everything. So let me teach it to you the way he taught it to me. Because if you learn nothing else from a widow and a railroad, learn this. When a railroad condemns your farm, Penn said, the court values it as a farm. Acres, what the dirt grows. $7, $8 an acre for scrub. That's what Voss offered you, and by that measure it's not even unfair. He turned the book toward me. But that is not the rule that governs land the railroad cannot do without. When a crossing, a descent, a single strip of ground is the only way the road can be built. When there is no other route, no substitute, no going around, the law does not value it as a farm. The law values it as what it is worth to the man who must have it. A monopoly on the only door. And the price of the only door, Ada, is not measured in acres. It is measured in what it costs the railroad to be locked out. I looked at that page a long time. So the cut, I said slowly, isn't worth $7 an acre. The cut, Penn said, is worth whatever the Trans-Meridian would otherwise have to spend to get to that bridge without it. Which, given that bluff, and given their season, and given Emil's own notes on that shale, is a very great deal of money. Ada, if I'm reading your husband's grades right, the cut isn't worth hundreds. It's worth thousands, many thousands. It is worth so much more than they offered you for the whole farm that the number would embarrass a decent man. He took his spectacles off again. And they warned you off it themselves. They named the wrong 40. They will condemn the wrong 40. And when they come to the right one, they will come as buyers, not as condemners. Because you'll have let them spend their charter power on the scrub, and there's a rule they can't condemn what they've already bypassed as though it were nothing. He sat back down heavily. God help me. It's clean. Then it's clean, I said. It's also, he said, not without risk. You'd be letting a giant walk right up to the edge of the thing before it knows. You'd be staying quiet while men build a railroad toward a wall. That takes a colder nerve than most people have, Ada. I thought of the stake coming out of the grave with that little suck of earth. I thought of regrettable, said like weather. I've got the nerve, I said. Now I want to be honest with you about one more thing I did, because it's the part where my husband's hand comes fully into it. And I won't have you think I did this on cleverness alone. I did not trust myself. I could read Emil's plat now, after that long night, but I was a farm woman who'd learned it in the dark in one sitting, and the whole plan stood on his grades being right. So I did not rely on love. I hired a stranger. I sent to the next county over and I paid a licensed surveyor I'd never met. A man with no stake in Kellner's Ford and no reason to flatter me, and I had him come out and run the bluff himself, cold, from scratch, and set it down in his own hand under his own seal. He was 2 days at it. He climbed the cut, and he shot the grades, and he walked the whole broken face of that bluff for a mile each way. And on the second evening he came down to the house, and he laid his figures on my kitchen table next to Emil's old plat, and the 2 sets of numbers, 30 years apart, drawn by 2 men who'd never met, matched down to the inch. The stranger looked at Emil's plat a long time. Then he looked at me. Whoever ran this original, he said, quiet, didn't miss anything, not one corner. In 30 years I've not seen better. And he tipped his hat to a dead man he'd never known, and I had to go stand at the window a minute before I could see straight. That was the weapon, not my cleverness. My husband's 30 years, confirmed by a stranger's honest chain, sealed and filed and beyond any lawyer's power to wave away. The dead man had drawn the trap. All I had to do was keep still and let them walk into it. They filed the condemnation on a Tuesday. It went the public way, the way these things go, and I'll paint it for you because it's where it all first came into the open. Hearing notice day. The courthouse in the county seat, and the town gathered because a railroad taking a widow's land is the most interesting thing to happen in Osgood County in a year, and half of them had come to watch it happen and be glad it wasn't them. Voss was there, easy in his city boots, that leather case under his arm. And there was a new man beside him, a polished man, a company man down from the division office, Colonel Merritt Shaw, the superintendent, the one above Voss, in a good coat, with the kind of calm that comes from having never once been told no. He treated the whole courthouse like a formality he'd already paid for. They put a map on an easel at the front, a big, clean railroad map with the corridor drawn in a confident red line. And they read the petition aloud, the legal words, the description of the land the Trans-Meridian meant to take. The southeast quarter of the quarter. The scrub. Read out loud to the whole town, in the record, in the wrong words, exactly as they'd filed them. And I stood alone at the rail at the front, in my good dark dress, and I let them read it. Every word. I did not say the ground was wrong. I did not say a thing. But I had come to do one thing, and I did it, and this is the hinge the whole story turns on, so watch it close. When the reading was done, before the crowd, I stepped up and I handed Harlan Voss a paper of my own. Written out plain, in my own hand, and witnessed, pen had seen to the witnessing, 2 signatures and the date. And I had a second copy of that same paper, and that one I had already walked across the square that morning and filed with the county recorder, stamped and dated and entered in the book, where it would sit whether anyone read it or not. The paper said this, in short, that the description in their petition named the South Scrub, that the grade their railroad required lay not on the scrub but on the patented 40 to the north, which they had not named, that they were by their own filing condemning land their tracks could not use, and had been so notified in writing by me, this day. I gave Voss the paper and I watched him read it. And I want you to see his face, because I saw it, and I have kept it. He read it, and the corner of his mouth went up, and he looked at Colonel Shaw, and he looked back at me, and he did the thing that sealed him. He laughed. Not loud. A short, amused breath through the nose, the laugh a man gives a child who's told him the moon is made of cheese. He folded my paper in half without finishing it, and he tucked it into his case, and he said it loud enough for the near rows to hear, because he wanted the town to hear how clever he was. Farm arithmetic, he said. And he turned back to the front, to his clean red map on the easel, to the business of taking my land. He thought he'd just brushed off a widow. What he'd actually done, in front of the whole town, with a clerk somewhere writing it down, was refuse a warning in writing that he'd already filed a second copy of at the recorder's office, the paper that, months from now, was going to walk back into a courtroom and convict his railroad out of its own contempt. He'd been told. On the record. In front of witnesses. And he'd laughed and filed the wrong 40 anyway. I picked up my copy, folded it back into my bag next to nothing at all, and I went out through that crowd, and the Odlin brothers stood aside to let me pass and did not quite meet my eye, because they thought they were watching a woman lose. And old Truxton the ferryman touched his hat brim. And I got in my wagon and I drove home to the 40, to the house, to the mantel, where a brass-tagged stake stood on its flat end, with the letters turned out. T. Emry. Co. I stood in front of it a while in the quiet. And I'll tell you exactly what I said to it, because I'd made up my mind on the drive, and there was no going back from it after. And part of me wanted to say it out loud in the empty house, so it would be true. All right, I said to the stake. Go on and build. Because I'd decided. I was going to let them win. I was going to stand up at that condemnation hearing and give Harlan Voss every last acre of the 40 he'd asked for, the whole worthless scrub of it, and sign it over with a steady hand and not say one word about the rise, or the cut, or the only door down to the river. I was going to let a railroad spend a season and a fortune building a track toward a wall, and I was going to keep still as a stone the whole time, and let his own paper and my husband's plat and the law about the only door do the rest. He wanted the land. He was going to get the land. He just wasn't going to be able to run a single train across it. The first frost came and went, and the railroad believed it had won. You have to understand how a thing like that looks from the outside. To the town, to the Odlin brothers, to anybody watching from the road, it looked like Harlan Voss had rolled clean over a widow and never felt the bump. The court gave him the 40. The paper said so. He'd stood up in that hearing room and taken the south quarter of my ground for $312, and he'd signed it, and I'd signed it. And I had not said one word about the rise or the cut or the only door down to the river. So he thought it was done. I let him think it. That was the whole of my plan, and it was not a comfortable one to live inside. There's a particular kind of quiet you have to keep when you're right and everybody around you believes you've been beaten. It sits on your chest at night. I'd lie there in the dark of that house and hear the wind come down off the tableland, and through the cut, the same low sound Emil used to say was the land breathing. And I'd tell myself, hold still. Hold still. The paper's already written. Let them read it themselves. They started grading in October. I could hear them before I could see them. A railroad building itself across open country is not a quiet thing. There's the scrape of the slips, the drag of the Fresnos, the men calling to the mules, the ring of the sledges on the spikes far off. It carries for miles on a still morning. I'd be at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold and Emil's plats spread out under my hand, and I'd listen to them come. Voss came with them. He liked to ride the line. I'd see him on that gray horse of his, out past my fence, sitting up tall in the saddle the way a man sits when he's being paid by the mile and every mile is money in his pocket. Twice he touched his hat to me across the field. Twice, like we were neighbors. Like he hadn't stood on my porch and told me the only choice I had was whether I was paid or not. I raised my hand back to him both times. Just lifted it, the way you'd wave off a fly. Let him make of that what he wanted. There's a thing I learned that autumn about how the powerful talk when they think they've settled you. They get generous with their words. They tell you things. Young Peel, the elevator clerk, the same boy who'd written Voss's offer down in his tally book, he came out to the house one evening on his own horse, hat in his hands, looking like he'd swallowed something. "Mrs. Renner," he said, "I don't rightly know if I'm meant to tell you this." "Then you'd better," I said. "You've come all this way too." He told me Voss had been down at the elevator that afternoon, talking big to the men waiting on the scale, boasting, saying the branch would be laying steel across the river by grain season, saying he'd secured the whole corridor and secured it cheap, and that the company had a bonus riding on his name for it. And then, Peel said, Voss had laughed and said a thing that made the boy's ears go hot. He said, Peel looked at his hat. He said the smartest thing he ever did was buy a surveyor's 40 off a woman who couldn't read the survey. I didn't say anything for a moment. The lamp ticked. Out the window the last of the light was going off the rise where Emil lay. "Well," I said finally, "he's half right. He did buy a surveyor's 40. Peel waited for the rest of it. I didn't give it to him. I thanked him for the ride out, and I gave him a jar of my plum preserves to carry home to his mother, and I stood on the porch and watched him go, and I thought, let him boast. Every word of it. Boast in front of the whole scale line. There's a foreman out there with a map, and one of these weeks that map is going to tell him something Harlan Voss doesn't want to hear." That week came sooner than I'd guessed. There was a foreman on the grading crew, a square, careful man named, I never did get his right name. The men called him Dutch. And Dutch was the first one out there to look at the ground the way Emil would have looked at it. I heard about it after, from 2 directions, so I know it happened close to the way I'll tell it. The crews had graded down out of the tableland and were working toward the river, following the stakes Voss's party had driven. And Dutch stopped one morning with the map in his 2 hands and stood on the lip of the South 40 and looked down at where the line was supposed to go, and he frowned. Because the map said the grade ran on down to the bridge site from there. And the ground said otherwise. The ground said the South 40 didn't descend at all where they needed it to. It broke off soft. Alkali and sand, and a bank that slumped when you looked at it, the kind of bank you cannot set a bridge footing into, cannot hold a fill on, cannot do one useful thing with. And the only place in that whole reach of river where the land came down clean and firm, and at a grade a locomotive could pull, the only door, was a 1/4 mile north. On the rise. Through the cut. On my patented 40 that their petition had never once named. Dutch saw it. Standing right there with the map in his hands, he saw it. And he went and found Voss and told him. I'd have given a good deal to have watched Harlan Voss's face in that minute. I didn't. I only heard how it went. Dutch laid the map down and put his thumb on the South 40 and said, near as I ever got it, that they'd graded to a dead end. That the parcel the company had condemned couldn't carry a track to the bridge. That the descent had to come through the draw to the north, and the draw wasn't in their right of way. And Voss waved him off. That's the part I want you to hold on to. He waved him off. A careful man stood in front of him with the truth in his hand, and Harlan Voss, who was paid by the mile and had a bonus riding on his name, told his own foreman he was reading it wrong. Told him farmers and their draws all looked like doors and none of them were. Told him to keep grading and let the engineers worry about the last 1/4 mile. Farm arithmetic. Same thing he'd said to me at the hearing, with the whole town watching. It was the only kind of arithmetic the man knew how to do, and it was the kind that only adds and never once subtracts. So they kept grading. Toward the wall. I want to tell you it felt like triumph watching that. It didn't, not clean. There's a cost to being the only one in the county who knows how a story ends while everyone else is still living the middle of it. The Odlin brothers thought I'd been fleeced. The widow Hessel wouldn't quite look at me at church. Even Josiah Penn, who knew the whole of it, who'd sat with me at my own kitchen table and gone white when he finally understood what the railroad had filed. Even Penn kept asking, in that cautious way of his, Whether we oughtn't to move, do something, file something, before the crews found out on their own. No, I told him. We've done the one thing that matters. It's already filed. Let them find it. Ada. He took his spectacles off and rubbed his eyes. He was past 60 and half out of the law already, and I was making him nervous. If they find that grade won't serve and they come back on us angry, then they come back, I said. Angry's fine. Angry pays the same as sorry. Better, maybe. He put his spectacles back on and looked at me a long time. He'd known Emil 40 years. I think in that minute he saw some of Emil in me, because he stopped arguing. The crews reached the bank the second week of November, and everything stopped. You can't hide a railroad stopping. The scrape and the ring and the calling to the mules, it all just quit. One morning I came out to the porch and the country was silent. Silent the way it hadn't been since they'd started. And I stood there with my cup and listened to that silence, and I understood it. They'd hit it. They'd graded down to the soft bank and looked over the edge, and there was nothing there to build on, and every man on that line now knew what Dutch had known for weeks and what I had known since the night I first spread Emil's plats out under the lamp. The South 40 was a dead end. The railroad had bought itself a dead end for $312 and a bonus in Harlan Voss's name. That evening the neighbors came. They came the way country people come, without being asked, one wagon and then another, until my kitchen was full of them. The Odlin brothers, both of them, hats off, awkward as boys. Old Truxton, the ferryman, who'd tipped his hat to me at the hearing when everyone else thought they were watching me lose. The widow Hessel with a covered dish because she didn't know what else to bring. They stood around my table and my stove, and they didn't rightly know how to begin, so I began for them. You've all been thinking I got beat, I said. Go on, it's all right. I let you think it. The older Odlin turned his hat in his hands. We heard the line stopped, Ada, down at the river. Heard it can't get across. It can't, I said. On account of the ground? On account of the ground, I said. And on account of a paper Harlan Voss filed without reading, and on account of Emil surveying every corner of this county for 30 years and leaving me his eyes to see it with. I put my hand flat on the plats where they lay on the table. The only place a train can come down off that tableland to the bridge is through the cut. And the cut is mine. Clear title. Federal patent, hanging by the clock in my parlor this minute. And the 40 they took, the one they condemned, the one they're standing on right now with their mules and their money, a train can't cross it. Not their train. Not any train. They built themselves a mile of road to nowhere. The kitchen was very quiet. Truxton, the ferryman, was the first to laugh. It came out of him low and slow, an old man's laugh, and he shook his head. By God, he said. By God, Ada Emilby, and he didn't finish it. And he didn't have to. And then they understood, all of them, what it meant. And not just for me. Because their crossings rode on mine. Their grain prices rode on whether the branch came in beholden to a railroad that could set any rate it pleased, or whether the branch came in beholden to a widow and 40 acres that the railroad could not go around. The younger Odland worked it out loud, half to himself. If they got to have your cut, he said slowly, and there's no other door. Then they pay what a door is worth, I said. Not what an acre of scrub is worth. What the whole line is worth to them. Because a thing they must have and cannot get anywhere else isn't priced like farm dirt. Penn taught me that, and I'll teach it to you so you know it for your own ground someday. When you're the only way through, you're not selling land, you're selling the road itself. They pledged me their solidarity that night, in the plain way farmers do, not speeches, just the older Odlands saying, whatever you need from us, hearing day, we'll be there, and the rest nodding. 30 wagons, it would come to. But that was still ahead. Before they left, I did a thing I'd been turning over for a while. I went to the mantel and I took down the stake. You remember the stake. The brass-tagged survey stake the railroad's own crew had driven into the raised earth of Emil's grave that first Thursday, before any of this began. I'd pulled it out of the mound with my own hands and carried it to the house and stood it on the mantel on its flat end with the letters turned out, T.M. Co., where I could see it every day and not forget what I was owed. It had stood there through the whole of it. Through the offer and the deadline and the hearing and the long silent autumn. I took it down and I wrapped it in a cloth and I set it in my bag. "What's that for?" Truxton asked me. "That," I said, "is going to court." The railroad came back to my porch on a Tuesday. It was the same porch. That's a thing I'd like you to sit with a moment. The very same boards where Harlan Voss had stood in the summer with his printed offer and told me the only choice I had was whether I was paid or not. That same porch. And now here came Voss again. And this time he wasn't alone. And this time he wasn't tall in the saddle. This time Colonel Merritt Shaw had come down from the division office himself. Shaw, the superintendent, the polished one, the one who believed the law was just a formality that money smoothed over. He came up my steps in a good coat with his hat already in his hand, and Voss came behind him a half step, and Voss would not look at me. I did not ask them to sit. I did not put the coffee on. "Mrs. Renner," Shaw said. He had a fine voice, a voice made for boardrooms. "I think you know why we've come. I expect you've come about your railroad," I said. The one that stopped. Something moved in his face, and he put it away. "The company finds itself needing a construction easement across the north portion of your property. The draw. We're prepared to be more than fair about it. Considerably more than fair, given the circumstances." "The circumstances," I said. "The engineering circumstances." "You mean the circumstances where you condemned the wrong 40, I said, after I told you in writing, in front of the whole town, that you were condemning the wrong 40. Voss's jaw worked. Shaw kept his composure, but I saw the cost of it. "There was a misunderstanding in the survey description," he said carefully. "These things happen. What matters now is that we resolve it sensibly as reasonable people. The company can offer a generous figure for the easement. Say, a fair multiple of the original. The original was $7.80 the acre," I said. "You want to talk to me in multiples of that." A generous multiple. I looked at him a while. The wind came down through the cut behind the house, that low breathing sound, and I let it fill up the quiet before I answered. "Colonel Shaw," I said, "you don't buy a door for a multiple of what dirt costs. You buy a door for what's on the other side of it. And what's on the other side of my door is your whole branch line, your bridge, your grain season, and the bonus you've got riding on it. That's the price, not my number. Yours, whatever all of that is worth to you, that's what the cut costs. Because there's no other way down, and you know it, and I know it, and Harlan Voss has known it since his own foreman told him weeks ago and he waved the man off." At that Voss finally spoke. "Now you listen, no?" I said, not loud. "You listened once, on the courthouse record, and you laughed. And you called it farm arithmetic. It's your turn to hear it counted out." Shaw tried the thing they always try when the honest road runs out. He tried to make it sound like force. He said the company's charter granted it the corridor, and that a corridor implied the reasonable means of descent within it, and that the cut, lying where it did, might be held to be included by necessity whether it was named or not. He said it smoothly, like a man laying down a winning card. I'd been waiting for that card. Penn had told me it would come. "Send for Josiah Penn," I said. "And bring your charter. We'll read it together at the courthouse, in front of the recorder, where there's a copy of a certain warning I filed the same day I gave one to Mr. Voss, the paper that says, in my hand, witnessed and dated, that your petition named the South Scrub, and that the grade you needed sat on my patented 40 which your petition did not name. You were told. On the record. Before you spent $1. The law doesn't let a company be told a thing in writing, refuse it, condemn the wrong ground on purpose, and then come back and take the right ground cheap because it turned out they needed it after all. That's not a corridor implying a necessity, Colonel. That's a necessity you were warned of and chose to ignore. And a necessity you must have, and cannot get anywhere else, is valued at exactly that, at everything it's worth to you. Shaw's face had gone still. He was doing the arithmetic now, the real kind, the kind that subtracts. He made one last move. He stood up straighter and he said the company would reroute. Take the branch around entirely. Come down to the river somewhere else. Leave the widow her worthless draw and her pride. And here is where 30 years of Emil surveying every corner of that county became the weapon it was always going to be. Because I had his plats. I had walked that river with him. I knew what Shaw was only guessing at. There's no other descent in your chartered corridor, I said. I've got my husband's surveys of every foot of that river reach on my backroom desk, and I've had a licensed man from the next county confirm every grade of them to the inch, under his own seal. From the head of your corridor to the foot of it, the Renner cut is the only door. You reroute, you're outside your charter, and outside your charter you start the condemnations over from nothing. A new corridor, new landowners, new years, past your grain season, past your bonus, past the patience of whoever it is you answer to in the home office. You won't reroute, Colonel. You can't. You'll be back at this courthouse inside the month asking a judge to sell you my door at a fair price, and I mean to let him. For a moment nobody moved on that porch. Then Shaw put his hat back on his head. He did it slowly. And he said, "We'll see you at the courthouse, Mrs. Renner," and it wasn't a threat anymore, because we both knew what the courthouse held for him. And he turned and went down my steps, and Voss went after him not looking at me, and I stood on the boards where he'd told me the only choice I had was whether I was paid or not, and I watched the two of them ride away small across my 40 toward the railroad that could not cross it. Then I went inside, and I put the coffee on, for myself, and I sat down at Emil's desk. And I will not tell you I didn't put my head down on those plats for a minute. A woman's allowed that much, alone, with no one to see. Hearing day, they came from all over Osgood County. 30 wagons. I'd been told there'd be a crowd, and I hadn't believed it until I drove into Kellner's Ford and saw them ringed all around the courthouse square, teams standing patient in the cold. Men and women I knew, and half I didn't, come in to see whether the railroad that had been rolling over everybody's ground for 2 years was finally going to be made to stop for one widow's 40 acres. The Odlin brothers had a place saved for me at the rail. Old Truxton was there in his good coat. Young Peel had brought his tally book, the one with Voss's offer written down in it in his own hand. Josiah Penn met me on the courthouse steps. He looked 10 years younger than he had all autumn. One last clean case. I could see it on him. Inside, the room was packed to the walls and the aisle. Shaw sat at the company's table in his good coat with the company's lawyer beside him, a sharp young man down from the city. Voss sat behind them, and Voss had the look of a man who has finally, fully understood and understood too late. Penn laid 3 papers on the oak table before the judge, side by side, where the whole room could see. The first was the railroad's own filed petition, the one that named the South Scrub. The southeast quarter of the quarter, in the company's own printed words, T.M. Rye. Co. Signed by Harlan Voss. The second was my warning, my notice, in my own hand, witnessed and dated, stamped by the county recorder the same day I'd handed a copy to Voss at the hearing. The paper that said, before they'd spent $1, that they were condemning ground their tracks could not use, and that the grade they needed lay on my patented 40, which they had never named. The third was Emil's plat. My husband's survey, in his small square hand, tied for years with string in his desk drawer, and beside it the hired surveyor's confirmation under his own seal, every grade proved to the inch. The dead man's eyes, laid open on the table for the court to look through. And then I did the thing I'd carried the stake to court to do. I took it out of my bag, and I unwrapped the cloth, and I set the brass-tagged stake down on top of the 3 papers, flat end down. The letters turned out. T.M.R.I. Co., the railroad's own marker, on the railroad's own papers, in the middle of the railroad's own courtroom. The room went so quiet you could hear the stove. "Your Honor," I said. I had meant to say a great deal. I'd lain awake with speeches. But standing there with my hand on that cold brass, I found I only wanted to say the one true thing. "This stake," I said. "Your men drove into my husband's grave. The first day. Before you'd asked me one question or read me one paper. You drove it into the raised earth where Emil Renner is buried. On the rise at the edge of my 40. I looked at Shaw, and then I looked at Voss, and I let it rest on Voss. You never checked whose grave. You never checked who's 40. You never checked your own survey against the man who made every survey in this county for 30 years. You were told, in writing, that you had it wrong. And you laughed and called it farm arithmetic, and you built a railroad into a wall." I lifted my hand off the stake. "I'm done talking now. The papers can say the rest." And I sat down. The company's sharp young lawyer stood up and tried. I'll give him that. He talked charter and corridor and implied necessity, the same cards Shaw had played on my porch. And Penn stood up slow and old and answered every one, and the recorder was called, and the recorder produced the filed copy of my warning with the date stamped on it, and the young lawyer's voice got quieter with each paper until there wasn't much left of it. The judge asked Voss to stand. He read Voss's own petition back to him. Read the description of the South Quarter aloud, the worthless scrub, in the printed words Voss had filed. Then he read my warning aloud, the whole of it, dated before the company had spent a cent. And then, and I did not ask for this, the judge did it himself, because young Peel's tally book had made its way into the record. He read back Voss's own words. "The only choice you've got is whether you're paid or not." And the smartest thing he ever did was buy a surveyor's 40 off a woman who couldn't read the survey. He read that last one twice. Voss stood there through all of it. He had a paragraph of his own ready, some careful thing about survey conventions and honest error, and the judge let him say it. And it fell into that quiet room, and nobody caught it. It just fell. His bonus was gone. His name on the corridor was gone. And Shaw, sitting at the company table, did not once turn his head to look at the man who'd built his railroad into a wall, and that not looking was the whole of Harlan Voss's future, written plain for the room to see. He sat back down, and he was finished, and everybody in that courthouse knew it, and the worst of it for a man like that is that nobody even hated him. They just stopped seeing him. Then the judge turned to the company, and to Colonel Merritt Shaw. He found for me. On every point. He let the condemnation of the South 40 stand exactly as the railroad had filed it, malicious to its own interest. But filed, and signed, and theirs. $312 of dead-end scrub, bought and paid for, and the court would not save the company from its own paper. Shaw would sign for it. He'd signed that the company had condemned and purchased a 40 its trains could never cross, in the company's own name, on the record, for the county to remember. And the cut, the court found, being the sole viable descent within the chartered corridor, being a thing the railroad must have and could get nowhere else, was not to be valued as farm acreage. It was to be valued as necessity. As the door itself. $18,400 for the crossing acres. Plus damages. Against 312. I heard the number go through that crowd like wind through wheat. Somebody laughed. Somebody else said hush. The Odlin brothers were grinning at their boots. And Colonel Shaw, the polished man who believed the law was a formality money settled, he found out that day that money is exactly the thing the law makes you pay when you've held it in contempt. He sat very still and he did the arithmetic one last time, and there was nothing in it that added the way he wanted, and he stood when the judge was done, and he buttoned his good coat. And he had the decency, or maybe just the training, to incline his head to me across that courtroom before he walked out into the square where 30 wagons stood. Shaw came back to the porch one more time, at the end of it, to sign the easement. Same porch. I want you to have that, one last time. The very boards. He came alone, hat in his hand, and I had a paper of my own ready for him this time. My terms in writing, plain, he could have his construction easement through the cut, at the court's price, all of it lawful. But he'd sign my conditions with it. The grave was to be fenced, at the company's cost, in white, and moved by no one, not one shovelful, not ever. The ground where Emil lay undisturbed for as long as there was a railroad to disturb it. And the crossing was to be named. Named on the plat, in the company's own maps, for the record and for good, Renner Crossing. He read it standing up. He didn't argue a word of it. What was there to argue? He took my pen and he signed his fine name to the widow's conditions, Colonel Merritt Shaw, Division Superintendent, and he handed the pen back. I did not pour him any coffee. He knew why. He put his hat on and he said, Mrs. Renner, and I said, Colonel. And that was the whole of our goodbye. And the giant went down my steps for the last time, having come back to ask, having been made to sign the price the quiet woman named. That was the winter of it. Now let me tell you the spring. The branch line runs through the cut now. It came in after the grain season. In the end, all that hurry, all that bonus, and Shaw's Road came in late anyway, the way things do when they're built on the wrong 40 and have to be built again on the right one. But it runs. Mornings I hear the whistle come up the draw, that same low country the wind used to have all to itself. And I've made my peace with the sound. It's a good sound now. It's a sound with my husband's name on it. There's a white fence up on the rise. The company built it, in the spring the way the paper said they would, and it circles Emil's grave clean and square, and the ground inside it has never been touched, and never will be. I go up of an evening sometimes and stand at that fence and watch the train come down through the cut he surveyed, on the grade he set, past the grave they drove a stake into without ever once checking whose it was. And I tell him how it went. I'm not ashamed to say it. A person's allowed that. At a grave, alone, with the light going gold off the tableland. The patent hangs back in the parlor by the clock, where it always hung, where I never once thought I'd need to take it down, and where, that long night, I did. I look at it more than I used to. And the stake, the brass-tagged stake, T.M. Rye Co., that they drove into my husband's grave and that I pulled out with my own two hands and stood on the mantel and carried to court and set down on top of their own papers, that stake is out in my garden now. I use it for a beanpole. It holds up the runners at the east end of the row, and come July it'll be green to the top of it, and I'll pick my supper off the railroad's own marker. There's a justice in that a courtroom can't hand you. You have to grow it yourself. They ask about the men. Sometimes, the neighbors do. So I'll tell you the little there is. Harlan Voss took a position with a smaller road, out west somewhere, Wyoming or the Territories, where the surveys are somebody else's problem, and nobody's heard the words farm arithmetic said back to them in a courtroom full of wagons. I don't wish him harm. A man like that carries his own, wherever the surveys are. Colonel Shaw finished his branch and moved on up the line the way company men do. His railroad crosses my cut to this day and pays me nothing further to do it because it's bought and paid at the price a door is worth, and I expect he's told the story a few times himself by now, in some boardroom, as a caution. The widow who read the plat, I hope he tells it right. And me, I'm still here. Still on the 40. 53 years old the autumn it started, and I'll not tell you how many more since. Still reading Emil's plats of an evening, still keeping the fence whitewashed, still growing beans up a stake that a railroad drove into a grave and that a widow drove, in the end, straight through the heart of a railroad's own map. Here's the whole of what I learned, and I'll say it plain and then I'll hush. What's taken unjustly never stays kept. It just waits, in the paper, in the ground, in the small square hand of a man who surveyed every corner for 30 years. For the day the taker builds himself into a wall he can't see, and has to come back, hat in hand, to the very porch. And a widow who can read a plat is not a widow without power. She's only a widow they haven't finished underestimating yet. They thought they were watching a woman lose. They weren't. Comment the town you're in, and whether anyone ever thought you were too small to fight what was coming for you.